and quality standards for realist evaluations and realist reviews, something which we are all familiar with, and if you're not, I suggest you go and find them. And she is a member of the research team currently developing realist economic evaluation methods. Now that is something I'm really interested in. I'm really looking forward to seeing about that. I think it's really important. Gill's used realist methods for over 20 years and teaches realist methodology at postgraduate level. And I think you do that online, is that right, Gill? So it's not all in person.
Yeah.
So if your time zone is better than the stuff that's offered over here in the UK, for people on the other side of the world, they might be best off checking out Gill's as opposed to trying to do something during the night, either through CARES or through Oxford here. So I've lost my place now. Let me go back. Yeah, you've provided professional development programs in 18 countries, some of them multiple times. That's quite impressive. That's quite a good travel resume. And you've developed several methods for realist research and realist evaluation and have been named as the top 2% of most influential scientists in your field in 2022 and 2023 Stanford University listings. Gosh, that's impressive. I have even more of an imposter syndrome now. So Gill is a fellow of the Australian Evaluation Society and a member of the advisory board for the Australian Journal of Evaluation. Gosh, Gill, what a resume. That's awesome. I don't think there's anything absent-minded there.
If only you knew. I started to giggle about the Stanford stuff. Top 2% of authors in my field, in a field in which I am not qualified because it's in medicine.
Wow. Okay, that is impressive. Yeah. So perhaps we all need like career mentoring from Gill. Perhaps that's what we need.
It tells you how silly those systems are. Anyway, thank you, Joe. I wasn't actually expecting to have the whole bit read out.
It's like being part of the red carpet, Gill. We have to do that like big introduction.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the big introduction. It really is a pleasure to be here. I will warn everybody before I begin that although I like reading and writing, technology and I like that. We did try and iron out the technological kinks before we began, but I'm not going to guarantee any of it. But where I do want to begin is by explaining that when you hear snoring in the background, it's my dog, not me. And when you hear a loud clattering noise in the background, that's the dog going out through the dog door. It's not me falling off my chair. So with that, I might get underway if that's okay, Joe. You happy for me to start?
Yeah, feel free, take over, share your slides, and we'll turn our cameras and mics off and we'll come back on at the end. If anyone has any questions whilst Gill is presenting, if you put them in the chat as we go, we'll deal with them all at the end in turn.
That would be fabulous. Thanks very much. Okay, so I will share screen, and with a bit of luck, you're going to be able to see that about now. Can somebody nod at me?
Yeah, perfect. Yes. See that, no problem. Well, I can anyway. So if anyone has any, we keep an eye on the chat. So if anyone has any tech issues, then please post that in the chat.
Okay. So the first issue I'm going to have is that I didn't make the background to the slides quite dark enough, and I have trouble seeing where the forward button is on the slides. So yeah, tonight, the title for tonight's talk is Same but Different, because there are multiple constructs of mechanism. They all have some things in common, but they all also have some differences. And I think they have different strengths and weaknesses as well. So what I want to do over the course of the presentation is talk through what some of those similarities and differences are. In Australia, we usually start meetings with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from the land of the Palawa peoples of northern Tasmania, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge that these lands were never ceded. I also extend my respect to any Indigenous people joining this session tonight and to the traditional owners of the lands from which all of you as participants here tonight are attending. So I want to begin with a little bit of an overview and a preamble and a bit of a disclaimer. I do then want to do an introduction to two very basic key ideas which are designed for the newcomers in the group. I think for most people there will be an opportunity to go and grab your coffee or whatever, but two very basic key ideas. Then I'm going to talk about what mechanisms are not, because there's a lot of misunderstandings about what they are. Then I want to talk a little bit about constructs of mechanism and how you choose constructs for your own work, and a little bit of question and discussion time. Hopefully quite a lot of question and discussion time. I've also included an example which I'll only use if we have time in the presentation. It's actually an example of how both mechanisms themselves can evolve over the course of a program, and how descriptions of mechanisms, plural, can evolve over the course of an evaluation. But we'll only do that if there's time. So the two key ideas for beginners first. The first is about these three key ideas in realist causation, which are context, mechanism, and outcome. I want you to imagine that I'm standing on planet Earth and I've got a tennis ball in my hand, and I'm holding my hand out perpendicular from my body, and I let go of the ball. If I'm on planet Earth, as in on that gorgeous tennis court, the ball will drop to the ground. If I'm in outer space, the ball will just sit there against my hand for quite some time before gently drifting away. If I'm back on Earth but underwater, the ball will float to the surface. Now, I have done exactly the same thing in all three circumstances, but the outcomes of me doing the same thing are different. And they're different because different mechanisms, different causal forces are actually causing the outcome. So me letting go of the ball is not what causes the outcome. We know that because in outer space, the ball doesn't do anything. It just sits there against my hand. But when I let go of it in these three different contexts, different mechanisms fire and thus cause different outcomes. That's the simplest way to understand these three key ideas in realist causation. Mechanisms cause outcomes. Which mechanisms fire or operate depends on the context in which the actions are taken. Actually, it depends on particular aspects of the context in which the actions are taken, but we'll come back to that a bit later on. The second really basic idea is comes from Roy Bhaskar, realist philosopher of science, and it's known in realist circles as depth ontology. What Bhaskar said was there are basically three levels of things that that we're working with when we're undertaking realist or any research and evaluation. There's the level of the empirical. That's the stuff that we can observe, we can measure, and it's what we often take account of in research and evaluation. Then there's the level of the actual. The actual is everything that exists and or happens, whether or not we experience it. And the empirical is, of course, a subset of the actual. The empirical and the actual are also subsets of the real, but there is another component to the real, and that is that which causes what happens. So mechanisms, which is the realist name for what causes what happens, mechanisms live, if you like, at the level of the real, but context lives at the level of the actual. Now, if you were to have a little think about the three icebergs here, and use them to understand these ideas of the empirical, the actual and the real. If we're on a boat on the surface of the water, then we can come along and we can observe the bits of the icebergs that are above the surface of the water. We can take their temperature, we can measure their size. We can probably also work out how fast they're traveling and where they're going and all sorts of things. So that's the empirical. If we can get underwater, then we can see the rest of the iceberg, and the rest of the iceberg is actual, sorry, it's real, it's there, it's actual, but we can't see it from the surface. We will not be able to see the mechanisms that caused the iceberg, no matter where we go. And if we want to understand how the iceberg came to be where it is, or why it's that shape and not some other shape like the other icebergs, then we're going to have to undertake quite different kinds of studies, because we're now asking questions about how and why rather than what. So the empirical and to some extent the actual deal with what is, whereas the real, the mechanisms deal with how and why what is as it is. Okay, so that's the two key ideas that underpin everything else that follows. From now on, beginners, you have to just keep up with the rest of us. And of course, my mouse has frozen, so now, there we go. Okay, so moving rapidly forward, I want to begin with the more detailed discussion of mechanisms by describing what mechanisms are not. Mechanisms, in a realist sense of the word mechanism, mechanisms are not program activities or program strategies. So when we say we provided capacity building workshops or we set up an integrated care pathway, those are program activities or strategies. They are not, in the realist sense of the word, mechanisms. Neither are mechanisms the things that you hear governments talking about all the time. Oh, we introduced a new funding mechanism. Now, what that means is we set up a new set of structures and processes for the delivery of funding. But that as well is not a mechanism in the realist sense of the word. The other thing that mechanisms are not is states of being. Sometimes I see in realist work things like mechanism of trust, or then described as because of the trust that existed between X and Y. Mechanisms are not just states of being, and that is important because it helps you distinguish between context and mechanism. And something like trust can be a context, a mechanism, or an outcome. If we say we ran this program and as a result of that there was higher trust between the participants, then trust is an outcome. If we say there was a really good level of trust between the patients and their therapists right from the beginning of the program, then we're describing a context. But if we say the development of trust, a process, then caused something else, then we're talking about trust as a mechanism. And so when we're describing trust as a state, that's either a context or an outcome. If we're describing it as a mechanism, it has to be described as a process. So that's what mechanisms are not. What are mechanisms? So here I want to try and explain some of the things that are agreed across all the various different constructs of mechanism. First of all, everybody agrees that mechanisms are causes. So a mechanism is that which causes a particular outcome or a particular state of affairs. The second thing is that mechanisms are real, and I don't just mean that in the Bhaskarian sense of in the domain of the real. I mean they are ontologically real. They exist. One of the realist ways of understanding what is it that is real is that anything that has real effects must in itself be real, whether or not it's material and whether or not it's observable. Now, causes by definition have effects, and so causes are real. That's important because sometimes you hear people talking about causes as though, about mechanisms as though they're ideas or imaginings of the researchers. For realists, they're not. They're actually real things, even though they're not material or observable. Next thing is that mechanisms are always processes. Even when we start from the very everyday notion of causes and causation, they're always processes. The thing we have to be careful about here is that all mechanisms are processes, but not all processes are mechanisms. So teaching is a process and learning is a process, but teaching is an action and learning is a mechanism. It's an invisible thing happening at another level of the system that causes an outcome, so it's a mechanism. Teaching, however, is not a mechanism for a realist. The next thing is that mechanisms involve interactions. There are always things interacting with each other in the processes that are causing the outcomes. What the constituent elements are that are interacting differs both across the constructs of mechanism and it also differs ontologically. So really there are real differences at different levels of systems and in different kinds of change processes. But there are always interactions. The next thing is that mechanisms are always operating at all levels of all systems all the time. Realism is heavily grounded in systems theory, or if you prefer, because some people argue about this, realism and systems theory are overlapping paradigms with many shared concepts. So if mechanisms are that which causes whatever the current state of affairs is, everything that now is at any level of any system must have been caused. And it must have been caused somehow, which means that there are mechanisms that caused it for a realist. That also means that for any mechanism at any level of a system, we can drop down to another level, if you like, and find the sub-mechanisms or the minor mechanisms that make up the overarching or the larger scale mechanism. So there are mechanisms at all levels of all systems all the time. The next concept is that mechanisms are actually emergent properties. Can't do a whole lecture on emergence now, but if you start from the idea that all systems are comprised of subsystems and all systems in turn make up part of larger systems, the things that one level of a system can do, its powers in realist terms, result from interactions between structures at lower levels of the system. And those powers are not reducible to the powers of the lower levels of the system. So we can say that as a result of the human brain and the human physiology, most humans have developed the capacity for language. Language is an emergent power of the human, but you can't just take the brain and have language, and you can't just have the biology without the brain and get language, because the emergent powers are not reducible to the powers of the subsystems. Another very common term that's used is underlying. I think that's there are several reasons why we use the word underlying. One is Bhaskar's concept of the real underlying, the actual and the empirical. Another is that the powers are caused by lower levels of the system, underlying levels of the system, if you like. It's potentially confusing and or inaccurate, because actually for a realist, causation happens up and down levels of systems. So if you've got downwards causation coming from higher levels of a system down to a system, calling it underlying feels a bit odd to me. But yeah, so mechanisms are often described as underlying. They're also often described as invisible. Again, two possible interpretations. One is Bhaskara's The Real, because the things that are in the real, unless they are also actual and or emergent, are not visible. The more ontological, perhaps, description is that the causes of any event or state of affairs are happening at different levels of the system than the outcomes that we are observing. So if you think about the chemical and electrical interactions that are the processes of thought within individual humans, we can't see those chemical and electrical interactions. We can't even see the thought, but we may be able to see the outcome of it. It's because they're happening at a different level of the human system. If you think about interactions between political and economic systems, those systems are so big that we can't see the interactions between them. We can only see the effects of them. So even in circumstances where some aspects of an interaction can be observed, so for example, communication between two humans, other levels can't be. You can't see the mechanism, the unconscious drivers of particular responses within that communication, for example. So as well as being invisible, mechanisms are also variable over time. What starts off as one kind of a mechanism, so for example, a conscious choice in response to a particular resource that's provided by a program, that's a mechanism. It's a reasoning and responses mechanism. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Can become another kind of mechanism, for example, habit, as a result of a third mechanism, the new pathways being built into our brains as a result into the brain structure through the biological process of myelination. So there are different mechanisms operating at the different levels of the system, but varying over time. Second last characteristic is that mechanisms are multiple. On a philosophy of science level, we would say that it usually takes many mechanisms for any one outcome to be created. Particularly when you look at complex programs, by which I mean programs in which outcomes are emergent, not just complicated programs with many bits. There are usually decisions being made by multiple actors, multiple stakeholders. Wherever there's a decision being made, there's a mechanism acting. So there are multiple mechanisms operating within any complex program. Any change in a system or any change in multiple systems, for example, where we try and do coordination programs across multiple systems, there are necessarily going to be different mechanisms at different levels of the systems and in the different organisations. And mechanisms are also, when we're talking programs and program mechanisms, there are also intended and unintended mechanisms. I want to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, so I'll leave that one for now. So these are all characteristics of mechanisms, almost regardless of which construct, let me try that sentence again. They're characteristics of mechanisms as they're understood by realists, almost regardless of which construct of mechanism you're using. One of those constructs, the one that most of us probably know best, is Pawson and Tilley's construct of program mechanisms. That's Pawson at the top and Tilley at the bottom, for those of you who don't know. What Pawson and Tilley said was, first of all, program activities are not mechanisms, but what programs do is provide something. They provide some kind of resource or opportunity or constraint. And that meets up with something inside people's heads. So reasoning or preferences or norms or collective beliefs. And the interaction between, there's the interaction bit, the interaction between the resource and the reasoning contributes to different decisions. There's a process. And those different decisions contribute to different behaviours, which then contribute to different program outcomes. So that's the basic, it's Pawson and Tilley's basic construct for program mechanisms. Now, program mechanisms are, of course, a subset of all mechanisms. Dropping back to the idea of intended and unintended program mechanisms. I want to use an example to make a point about one of my little bugbears. Let's imagine that our intervention is a health message being put out through a media campaign. It could be walk more, drink more water, don't share needles, drink less alcohol, don't care what it is, any kind of health message media campaign. The intended message, the intended mechanism for those health message media campaigns is shown at the top left of this slide. It is that the intended targets should hear the message, they should believe the message, they should prioritise it over their current behaviours, i.e. sitting on the couch watching telly instead of walking, eating chips and drinking beer. They're supposed to want to do what the health message told them to do and act as intended. And as a result of that, the individual health risks will be minimised. We as realist evaluators and researchers know that we're supposed to think about for whom this works and for whom it doesn't, and when it doesn't, what other mechanisms fire instead. So if we look at the one immediately below that, this happened with intravenous drug users in the early days of HIV campaigning in Western countries. The IV users didn't, or some of them didn't believe that they were at risk. They didn't actually believe you could catch HIV from an infected needle. They thought it was just the government trying to stop them having whichever was their, chosen way of having a good time. And so they disputed the message and undermined it with their peers, who of course were also people who were at risk. And as a result of that, the health risks were not changed. So that's within the intended target group. But if you look around the other four mechanisms on that page, we see that, in fact, there are a whole bunch of other people who are also potentially affected by this media campaign, and the mechanisms that are triggered for them either generate negative outcomes or generate very much longer term outcomes. And so my plea to people in the room is, don't just think within the intended target group when we're thinking about the for whom, think about the wider group of who might respond in what ways, which actor groups, and then do the disaggregation of for whom and for whom not within those actor groups. This is another little one. This is Dalkin, Sonia Dalkin and crew's operationalisation of the, that's not rest and recreation, it's reasoning and resources mechanism. One of the things that they argued in their paper was that if you separated out resources and reasoning, not to say that you didn't need them both, but if you thought of them as resources being introduced into a context and then triggering reasoning, it made it easier to make sure that, or to distinguish perhaps between mechanism and context. And so they said intervention resources are introduced in a context in a way that enhances a change in reasoning. This alters the behaviour of participants. And they repeat later the resource being the component of the intervention introduced in a context. Look, I see this a little differently, and I think there are two issues here. One actually has nothing to do with Sonia and the team. It comes from much earlier work, and it is that I don't think it's very helpful to use the term context to mean two different things in the same piece of work. So what realists mean by context is the particular aspects of context or a setting which trigger a mechanism. Excuse me. When we say the interventions or the intervention resources are introduced in a context, that's actually a different meaning of the word context. So my preference is to use the word setting when we don't mean context in a real sense of a word, just to keep it clear what we're talking about and to keep it focused for us. That what we really mean when we realists say context. More relevant for this presentation, though, is the bit that has to do with mechanisms and specifically what we mean by the term resource or resources in reasoning and resources. In my view, the component of an intervention, which they've argued is introduced in a context, is a component part of the intervention. It is therefore, by definition, not a mechanism or part of a mechanism. It's also visible in this case. The palliative care register is something that you can see and act on. There is a relationship between the program and the resource. There is a relationship between the things that the program does, produces, uses, in this case, the palliative care register. But I don't think that that is the resource. I think the resource is whatever it is that people draw from the intervention component as distinct from the intervention component itself. And I also think that different people, oblique stroke, different subgroups, draw different resources from the same intervention component. I don't actually understand the operation of palliative care registers well enough to argue that case here. So I'm going to use a couple of different examples to make my case. So this is a real case. It comes from an article that I drew on in a Realist review about 150 years ago, or maybe 10 years ago. And it was to do with social accountability strategies, and in this case, using cameras to improve teacher attendance at school in low and middle income countries where teacher non-attendance is a very big issue. So in rural India, a non-government organisation running non-formal education centres, those are little one-teacher schools for children up to the age of 8 in rural and remote areas. And they provided the teachers with a tamper-proof camera, and they required a photo to be taken of the teacher with at least 8 students at the beginning and end of each working day. The time and date stamps on the photographs then acted as proof of the teacher's attendance. And photographs were forwarded to the NGO, and for the first time ever, the teacher's pay was directly related to their attendance. Now, if we were to treat that analogously to the palliative care register in the previous slide, we would say that the camera is the resource. But I don't think that's right. I think there are several actor groups whose behaviours might be affected by the intervention, and I think the resource for each of them is going to be different, and the reasoning for each of them is going to be different. So I'd argue here that the resource for the teacher is actually their pay, and the resource that the camera provides is the evidence that proves their entitlement to their pay, which is actually a different thing than the camera itself. The resource for the NGO is information about teacher attendance, and it's explicit information about which teachers are attending and how often they're not attending, which empowers the school to then act in response to their non-attendance, not just by only paying them for the days they turn up. The resource for the students is actually the teacher. The resource for the parents might be the confidence that the teacher is going to turn up at school, which might affect their confidence to send their kids. So there's a whole bunch of different resources here. Just as an aside, the title for this article was called Monitoring Works, which rather suggests that the mechanism in the program is monitoring. I don't think that's right either. Monitoring is the program's strategy. The mechanism for teachers is changing the incentive structure. It's changing, you only get paid if you turn up for work for the first time, and you have to prove that you turned up for work. So it's changing the incentive structure for turning up to work. So that's my first example, that the resource is not the same thing as aspects of the intervention strategy. Second example is about parenting programs. I did some evaluation of parenting programs in my PhD and in the early years after that. And through those evaluations, discovered that parents were taking quite a wide range of different resources from the same parenting programs. So they were getting information about child development, information about parent-child relationships, information about how to support appropriate behaviour by their kids, information about how to manage their own behaviour in response to their children, particularly when they were driving them mad. But they also got some less obvious resources, things like permission to feel, permission to express their feelings, a developing understanding of how things in their past had affected them and their parenting, therapy, peer support, a whole bunch of different kinds of resources, some of which were intended in the programs and some of which weren't. And just as an kind of aside, then looking at the reasoning that was associated with these resources, down the left-hand side of the table, you see a list of 14 things that parents said the programs helped them to do or helped them with. And the colour coding of those things is the way they load together, and this is the results of a factor analysis, obviously. So the things that were introduced into the questionnaire as indices for particular mechanisms. So there were 5 mechanisms, as it turned out, that were operating within those 14 things that the parents had told us. And they are there colour-coded. So understanding the child is one, stress reduction is another, reducing shame and guilt about yourself as a parent, increasing the locus of control, and then one that I labelled therapy, understanding how the things in my past have affected me and dealing with that. The other thing that I liked about this as an example is that it shows that the factor analysis, the component analysis in the figures on the right-hand side of the table, show that some of those mechanisms are firing together. So understanding the child and internal locus of control, so the bright red, and the light blue, fired together and explained most of the change in the outcomes. But there were also other mechanisms that fired together. And I think that's evidence of this notion that there are multiple mechanisms firing in any intervention in order to generate the outcomes. The outcomes were things like changed parenting behaviours, changed child behaviours, changed parent-child relationships, etc. Okay, now all of that, including that last example, was constructed, undertaken using Pawson and Tilley's construct of reasoning and resources. But I think that there are a bunch of limitations with the reasoning and resources construct. Firstly, by definition, reasoning and resources can only operate at the cognitive level of the individual human. Pawson argues that agency, slightly different than reasoning, but choice making and decision making also happens collectively, and I agree with that. But I think the mechanisms that are operating in groups and collectives are actually different than the mechanisms that are operating within individual humans. You get groupthink operating as a group mechanism. That's a different mechanism than the processes by which individuals make decisions. The reasoning and resources construct also assumes that individuals are the targets of programs. Well, they are for behaviour change programs, but there's a whole bunch of other programs out there in the world that do not aim to change individual behaviours. You can think about programs that aim to empower or disempower unions or employers in the industrial relations system. You can think of some kinds of international development programs, which are actually about trying to democratise developing countries. So there's a whole bunch of programs out there that do not target individuals. The next potential problem is that Pawson and Tilley saw programs as being, and this is a quote from Realistic Evaluation, rational choice situations. The problem with that is that actually it has become apparent over the last little while that humans aren't particularly rational. I'm going to just flick forward a slide here and show you something. I love this slide. This is called the Cognitive Bias Codex, and I stumbled on it quite by accident last night while I was preparing this presentation. And every one of the small dots radiating out from the centre, from the image of the brain, is a different form of cognitive bias. Geez, I wonder why we're not very good at being rational if all those things are potentially affecting the way we make our decisions. Okay, going back a bit. If humans aren't actually very rational, then grounding our constructs of reasoning and resources in rationality is probably not the best way to go about it. The next problem is that reasoning and resources is a construct for an individual mechanism, but it can't actually take account of interactions between mechanisms, so we need something else to do that. And reasoning and resources is grounded in the assumption that there is a program or a policy or a something that is providing the resources. And in fact, in Ray's latest book, How to Think Like a Realist, he's no longer talking about mechanisms in terms of reasoning and resources. He's talking about agency, human agency, as being the overlying construct for mechanisms. My point here is reasoning and resources can be a really useful construct for thinking your way through some kinds of programs. But there are a whole bunch of other kinds of mechanisms that can't be described that way. And we need to be equipped to deal with other sorts of mechanisms at other levels of systems, in other situations, in order to be able to be more comprehensive in the kinds of programs that we can evaluate or the nature of the evaluation we can do. So what are some of these other constructs? The basic realist construct of mechanisms is the powers and liabilities of things. And there's a few key quotes here, all of which I quoted in my chapter, which I discovered after I looked it up, is not what I originally called it. I called it Revisiting Mechanisms. The chapter ended up being titled Understanding Mechanisms in Realist Research and Evaluation. It's in the book Doing Realist Research. But these quotes are about the basic realist construct of what mechanisms are. So Hurray and Madden said, the internal structures of things, along with the necessary relations, note that, the necessary relations between those structures, have the power to produce an effect in virtue of its nature. I would have said by virtue of its nature, but anyway. So internal structures and their necessary relationships have causal powers. Or Groff, causality is a matter of the real powers that things have in virtue of what they are to affect other things in specific ways. It's really important here to note that the term things does not necessarily refer to material things. Social structures and relationships and systems of ideas and beliefs are as much things as are material or biological things. So that's the fundamental realist construct. The powers and liabilities of things emerging from their internal structures and the necessary relationships between them. A couple of examples, and I'll do a material world example and a social example. Material world example. How does water get to the top of trees? It's an awful long time since I did biology at school. I had to go back and look it all up. There are actually three mechanisms involved in water getting up to the top of a tree, which are capillary action, which involves the adhesion between water particles and the side of the capillary, that's the little tiny tube the water's going up in, and cohesion between the water particles themselves. So that's mechanism one. Mechanism two is hydrostatic pressure. The leaves at the top of the tree, water is evaporating through those, which causes lower hydrostatic pressure at the top of the tree, which tends to draw water up through the capillaries. And osmosis is the third mechanism, the tendency of water to pass through the cell walls from wetter to dry areas. So as the top of the tree dries up, water moves up. So we've got three mechanisms involved in this process of getting water to the top of the tree. I've never had to evaluate getting water to the top of a tree. I've always had to deal with the social example. So here's a social example. So the example, I'm going to come back to this if we have time, is Citizen Voice and Action, which is a program that World Vision runs internationally, and it's a program which is designed to hold governments and service providers accountable to citizens for meeting the standards that governments set for how services should be provided. And CVA has been run in many, many countries and been found to be effective in many, many kinds of service systems, but not all. The example that I'm going to use here is that before the program, citizens were seen by health services and decision makers as being consumers of health services, but external to the health service system. The program structures brought citizens and or their, I say representatives, but it doesn't mean elected representatives. It means people who stood up and came forward. And health service providers were brought into necessary relationship through the processes of the program. Over time, citizens came to be recognised by administrators as being quite different from just consumers of health services. First of all, they were recognised for the first time as being a really valuable source of information about the quality of services. They were also recognised as being claimants with rights, political claimants with rights under the health service system, and they were recognised as being politically useful in advocacy for resources. Previously, health service managers had thought, if I say I need more resources, the higher ups in the system just go, yeah, everybody says they want more resources. But here they can see that it is not my self-interest, it is the citizens speaking, and that is useful for advocacy. There was also another set of mechanisms operating through which citizens were developing collective voice. The new structure that evolved as a result of this overarching, or this overall process, was that citizens came to be more inside the system, and the power relationships between citizens and the health services and between citizens and local government were quite dramatically changed as a result. That's the example that we're going to come back to in terms of evolving mechanisms if I stop talking too much and move forward fast enough. So my argument is policy and program relevant research and evaluation is much broader than just health service and or social service evaluation. It includes research into natural and social issues that underpin the need for services. It includes basic and applied research in biology, physiology, geology, a number of natural sciences, psychology, sociology, other social sciences. We need the material that those sciences are developing within program evaluation, but they are also things in their own right that you can approach from a realist point of view. And of course, it includes policy and program evaluation. So for realist approaches, realist methodologies to be as useful as they can be, they have to be able to be used across this wider field. That means that we have to have concepts that can be applied across those wider fields, and not all of them are going to be able to use reasoning and resources for everything. So what are the 5 ways to think about mechanisms then? 1, powers and liabilities, the abilities and weaknesses of things to affect other things, whether or not those are currently in use or currently manifest. That's the basic realist definition that we talked about a minute ago. Reasoning and resources from Pawson and Tilley. Forces. Forces either push or pull. Gravity is the obvious physical example. My favourite non-physical example, excuse me, is love, which pushes or pulls us to do extraordinary things. Interactions, a transfer from one party to the other, resulting in a changed state. The physical example is often gunpowder exploding. The interaction between the chemical constituents of gunpowder causes the explosion. A contract to buy a house is an interaction that results in changed states with different changed powers and liabilities as a result. If I bought a house yesterday, I've got a whole lot of new responsibilities and some new powers. If I sold a house yesterday, I've got more money, but some less powers and responsibilities. And processes. It's only particular kinds of processes that count as mechanisms, but feedback and feed forward sequences where their later segments absolutely depend on the earlier processes. So genetic inheritance, a stock market crash. These are the kinds of processes that are mechanisms. And this little table takes those 5 possible constructs of mechanism, which are now down the left-hand side and hard to read, I discover, and gives little examples for the material level, the psychological or cognitive level within individual humans, social group level, and the social institutional level, which is just to demonstrate that the constructs can be applied across the range of sorts of structures and or systems that are likely to be involved in my wider definition of the kinds of domains and disciplines in which we should be using realist approaches. Now, it's 8 o'clock. I'm supposed to leave the last half hour for questions, and I know there are a bunch of questions, so I'm going to skip the example, but people can ask questions about it if they want to. And I'll finish off by saying, okay, if there are 5 different constructs of mechanism, which one should we use? And my argument is you can use any of them and any others that you can make up, so long as they are consistent with the underpinning assumptions in a realist philosophy of science, which are that mechanisms are causal forces or processes operating at a different level of the system than the outcome that they generate, usually invisible, and that you have to have a description of at least the necessary components of the system, the necessary relationships between those components, and the processes or interactions between those through which those components and relationships generate their outcomes. Now, the mechanisms might also be on a very different time scale. If you think genetic inheritance or evolution or something, or even the effects of attachment styles on human development, the outcomes take a long time to manifest. Given that you can use any of them, how are you going to go about choosing which ones you will use? My starting point is always to start from outcomes and work backwards on the logic that the mechanism is the cause of the outcome. If you don't know what the outcome is, you can't possibly know what the cause is. If you're thinking about multiple outcomes, it's possible that they may actually need different constructs of mechanism, particularly if they're at different levels of systems. Think about the levels of the systems at which the outcomes or the phenomena of interest lie. And if they're not at the individual cognitive level, then is reasoning, as in reasoning and resources, an appropriate construct to use? Probably not. Choose one of the others. Is there actually an evaluand, or something being evaluated, or a program or initiative being researched? If not, is the resources being provided by the program appropriate? Sorry, excuse me. Are you drawing on a formal theory in your explanation? If you are, it may be that one construct or another fits best with that formal theory, and that would be a reasonable logic for choosing it. The other question I'd ask is, what are you choosing your construct for? What do you want to do with it? For me, form follows function. So you should be choosing the form of construct you want depending on what you want to do with it. And if what you want it to do is to help you think your way through mechanisms, then you might want a particular construct to help you think through particular types of mechanisms. It might be that you don't actually need a construct, that you can see just by applying the underlying principles, realist principles, invisibility, causal process, blah, 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 that is enough for you to be consistent and coherent in developing your constructs, developing your descriptions, of mechanisms. That was a very long talk. Sorry for gabbling on so much. Thanks very much for your attention and questions, comments, debates. I will forewarn you now that I haven't been able to read the questions going through while
That's
I was doing it.
Absolutely fine, Jill. We'll pose them one at a time. There are quite a few. It's been quite an interesting debate. So now you lot were all really good at this during COVID when you were all at home and you didn't have any social interaction. But one of the things that we have as a tradition, which we've had going for the last 5 years, is that you turn your cameras on at the end and you give Jill a nice clap. Now, I know we've had lots of reactions in the chat here, but if Jill was in a lecture theatre, we'd be all standing on our feet now. And I am fairly sure there's a number of PhD students who are going, oh my God, I'm so glad this is recorded. This is my methodology chapter, so I can go and get and write this up, because there are some things, especially around depth ontology and the different constructs of mechanisms, some of the earlier slides, that I know are going to be particularly helpful. So I have a vision that this is going to be one of our well-watched YouTube videos in the future. Perhaps I should do a yearly update by saying, by the way, you're our top watched video of this year. Maybe we should do that, Lauren. We should have a think about that. Anyway, so please turn your cameras on and your mics, as well as all these lovely floating hand points that we've got coming up the screen. And let's thank Jill very much for her awesome presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
okay,
Jill.
I can see a couple of people. Thank you for those that have joined in, and to the rest of you, that's just like bar humbug. Okay, so Jill, that was absolutely phenomenal. I have like a million questions of my own, but I think actually I'm gonna go straight to the chat, because there's some really thought-provoking ones that have come through. And what I tend to do is go one at a time. We might have some that overlap, so if we do, we'll try and do that. So I think with the first one is from Milou, if I have pronounced that correctly. If you are online and you want to ask your question yourself, then you can turn on your mic and your camera and come and ask the question, Milou, but if not, I can ask it on your behalf. And if anyone needs to leave, we do record the chat. So if you are not able to ask your question yourself, pop it in and you'll be able to view it on the recording later. Looks like they either have left or don't feel brave enough to come on board. Oh, you're there, you're there. Okay.
Yes, I'm there.
Okay.
Yes, so first of all, thank you so much. It's really great to hear you talk in person, and you made very interesting points. And I have a question, because I have been thinking about mechanisms a lot. And what helps me is to make a distinction between mechanisms in general and social mechanisms. Because I have the feeling that the mechanisms in general don't always need to be invisible. For example, I can fold my clothes and then you can see the outcome, a nice folded pile of trousers. And I am actually a visible mechanism, I think, for this outcome. And I think also, as far as I understood it, there's also a lot of invisible mechanisms, but it's not necessary. But if you talk about social mechanisms, then it's much more invisible. And I was wondering what you think about this distinction.
It's a very nice distinction. I hadn't thought about the idea of, that I'm visibly folding the clothes. I don't know that I would necessarily consider an action that results in an outcome, like folding clothes, to be a cause in the realist sense of the word, even though I concede that it is a cause in the normal everyday use of the word of the pile of clothes. But I haven't thought about it before, and I'm going to take it away and think about it some more. Very happy to hear what other people think about that.
Yeah. So if
I agree with you that most social mechanisms are going to be invisible.
Yeah,
sorry, Jo.
I was going to say, if there's anyone in the audience that wants to join in the debate, because I think this is what we're trying to do. There is so much controversy, so many definitions of mechanisms that exist. And I know we had conversations before we started about some of the challenges that I have when peer reviewing and trying to discern what people are defining as mechanisms. And I do wonder if this also comes from people's different epistemological, I can't even say the word this morning, epistemological positions as well. So I think it's an interesting debate. I'm with you, Jill. I wouldn't routinely package up an action leading to an outcome as a mechanism, but when I saw the question, it did make me think and go, oh, that's really interesting. So we've got a couple of people who put their hands up who want to join in on this. So let me just see. I need to activate a different thing. So we've got Tracy first and then Marie.
Hi, thanks so much. I was just thinking, yes, so you can see the action of folding the clothes, but then is the mechanism, what is it that's causing you to fold the clothes? So it's that like internal process that's going on is kind of like what is the mechanism? And then there's going to be a context that generated that. So if it's say you're motivated to close your or to fold your clothes, it's because your mum's coming home. That's the
Or fear.
context.
I think it would be fear.
That's my thinking.
I
So
really
then
like
we
that,
got,
Tracy. Yeah.
yeah, we've got Marie next.
You're on mute,
Marie,
Marie.
you're still on mute.
My family would like to have me on mute in real life, I think. It's sort of related to this kind of hidden invisible. I've been leading on the evaluation of a randomized trial in Ethiopia of a sort of a complex public health intervention. And one of the things I found, one of maybe the risks, I'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on about sort of a realist lens in evaluation I've come across, is that I've heard a lot about in my recent arrival into the realist world about it helps to see what's invisible or expose things that we may not be able to measure or see. But I found that some things are hidden sort of for a reason, and there may be risks of exposing. So, for example, we interviewed health workers. They said fathers don't get involved in the care of their babies. They don't care. They're not involved because they don't come to clinic. So they weren't seeing that kind of outcome. But when we dug into like interviews and stuff, fathers were involved in many different ways, and there had been mechanisms and reasonings with mothers saying, "No, listen, your best place to go." They also were helping in hidden ways, but there was a sort of a period they operated below radar because it was seen as domestic work, and there's a risk of exposing that and saying, "Oh, look, you're doing this," and therefore undermining that sort of their standing in the community. But at the same time, fathers said, we feel misunderstood and underappreciated because people cannot see what we're doing. So that just thing of exposure and being mindful about what you say and what you expose at the same time of wanting to expose what is important. So I'm just trying to navigate this, and I just wondered what your kind of that idea of exposing that iceberg underneath, or are you best just peeping under and knowing what's there and then coming up?
That's one of the all-time ethical questions. First of all, I don't actually think it's a particularly realist question because it comes up in lots of different kinds of evaluations. My view is that there are multiple factors to take into account. One of them is the level of risk and the nature of risk to which you are exposing. The second is whether or not it is individuals who are being exposed or practices. So can you do it in such a way that you're not actually putting anybody at risk, but you are changing the social perception of what is being done? And I had another one in my head a minute ago, but it's gone away. I'll add it into the text if I remember.
Thank
but I
you.
think it does depend. Yeah.
8 o'clock at night, Jill. I think you're forgiven. So I'm going to move on because we've got quite a lot in the chat trying to get through. So I think Yakubu's next. If you're still here. Yakubu.
Yeah, yes, I am.
Do you want to ask Jill your question?
Yeah, thank you. Oh, sure, I can do that. And thanks a lot, Jill. We share the same time zone. And forgive me if I'm not as coherent, but I'll try to be. I think mine is coming a bit from the Basquerian notion of mechanisms as generative forces that can exist within structure. Because I started from Ray Pawson's explanation, I really found the Basquerian one a bit confusing, but I do see the sense in the fact that there could be causation already happening even before an intervention happened. And I really appreciate a bit of clarity there if it's something you've grappled with. Of course, it's something you've grappled with, but yeah.
Of course. from the very early days of my study. And you didn't find Bhaskar confusing because of anything about the way you were interpreting it. Bhaskar wrote extraordinarily confusingly. I think that's what I was talking about when I talked about the powers and liabilities of things. That's basically the idea that the internal structures of things and the necessary relationships between them have causal powers in and of themselves. So I don't think Bhaskar was actually the first realist to say that. I think he just expressed it in slightly different words. So I think it is the basic critical realist meaning of the term mechanism.
I've just asked people if they've got any easy to understand resources to help expand on Bhaskar, to put them in the chat. I know I've always found Dave Eldevas's work easier to understand. I got myself tied up in knots with Pawson, to be honest, when I first started. So Bhaskar was very much outside of my league. So we will move on now, and I think it's Verity. And again, it's around the hidden and the real aspects of mechanism. So there's lots of discussion around this. Are you in, Verity?
Yeah, I was going to say it's kind of partly been answered already, I think, but it was just in some of the examples around what is and isn't a mechanism, it felt like some of the things at different levels still did seem visible, if like perhaps with the biological examples maybe not visible to the naked eye, or like the example of the NGO with the camera at like money, like the pay, I don't know, it's kind of arguably visible depending on how you're thinking about it. Or but yeah, really great talk. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I do want to respond to that. You can't actually see the process of adhesion or cohesion between the water molecules and the capillary in which they're traveling. You can't actually see the teacher's motivation of, I want my pay. They can say it out loud, but you can't actually see it. Those things are not visible with current tools. You can put somebody into a brain scan and watch parts of their brain light up when you threaten to take away their money or you promise them more, but that's not the same as being able to see the actual mechanism of, I want my money. And you can see the water rising up a capillary if you chop the tree in half, which, by the way, will stop it. So no, actually, you can't watch it. But you can investigate it in other ways. You still don't actually see the mechanisms. You see the results of the mechanisms.
All right. Is that helpful to Verity? Right, we'll move on to Hanna. Hanna, are you in the audience? Do you want to speak? You don't have to speak, by the way. I can ask you a question for you. Some people are in open plan rooms as well and don't have the ability to speak.
No, she's had to go to a meeting. So she said sometimes there need to be successions of mechanisms triggered for different agents before you get to certain outcomes. Absolutely, yes. Almost any complex intervention is going to require a series of mechanisms, it's going to require a series of decisions by a series of different people, and some of them are going to have to be sequential. Every time you see a decision, there is a mechanism at work. It's just a blanket statement. Every decision is underpinned by a choice. Every choice has a mechanism underneath it, or every choice is a mechanism for a decision. So absolutely, yes. What would be good or right language to explain successive or evolving mechanisms? Well, depending on whether they're successive or evolving, I'd call them either successive or evolving. I don't think there's anything wrong with that as language. Go for it.
And we've got the next one is from Andrew, if you're still here. I know we've dropped down quite a few people because the people go on to other meetings.
I am still here, and apologies, it's dark here. I'm in the same time zone as Jill. Thank you, Jill.
I know, but your background looks awesome, so I'm just jealous.
It's not really where he is at the moment either. Hi, Andrew.
That's right. It's not really real. I've loved this. I've loved this discussion, and I'll keep it to just one question. But yeah, really interested in like these more philosophical questions I've got to say around what makes a mechanism real. You know, are we just looking at its effects? Are we working backwards from real effects? And if there are real effects, then there must be real causes, or are we talking about potentials and powers and liabilities? Also interested in the idea of like that mechanisms are invisible. And I'm wondering if mechanisms are, you know, mostly invisible, or actually philosophically, whether we might be able to push it a bit further and say that mechanisms are actually always invisible because we only ever get to see the interactions or the effects. So by the time a change happens and we can see it, well, it's no longer a mechanism, it's changed into something else. But I think my question will be more around this idea, and the discussion just prompted it, which is if an effect is real, then yes, some real causal mechanism must have generated. So that's safe to say. Yet absence of an effect does not necessarily mean, or that does not necessarily make a mechanism or its power unreal. Could you just speak to, I know I've you know, commented on a lot, but you feel free to comment
on the second bit. Mechanisms are powers. They're not necessarily made manifest all the time. When they're not made manifest, it doesn't mean they're not real. It just means they're latent, not currently in operation. So a worker has the power to earn an income whether or not they're currently employed. Would you still classify them as a worker? Or a person who has the potential to be a worker has the potential to earn an income, blah, blah, blah. The tree has the power to grow. Does it do so? Depends on the context. The context determines which mechanisms fire. The mechanisms are real, they're latent if the context is preventing the mechanisms from firing. But latent and not real are different. So I would argue that, yes, mechanisms are real because they have real effects, and that the mechanisms are still real even if they are latent.
Harder to identify though when they're latent, because you kind of sometimes people can give you clues, can't they? If this, then I might, you know, then this might happen, this might influence my thinking. But some of them, I suppose that's how you end up with your unintended outcomes as well sometimes when you look back over time. Okay, so we move on now. I'm sorry if sometimes I can't work out if it's the first name, second name spelling. So I don't know if it's Rasha or Akasha. So if I'm sorry, I've got it wrong. You can explain. If you're still here and you want to come on and ask your question to Gill, please do so.
Yeah, thank you. It's Rasha. Thank you very much, Gill. That's really interesting. I think my question is, I think it's the first time today that I've been introduced to the idea that outcome mechanisms should happen at a different level to the outcomes. And I found that challenging because in my work, we usually organize outcomes into distal outcomes, proximal and intermediate outcomes. And I usually find that the most immediate proximal outcomes happen at probably the same level at the mechanisms.
Can you give me an example, Rasha?
I'm trying to, I was trying to contemplate an example. So for example, one intervention that we did to support nurses do more vascular assessment is offering them the opportunity of attending a shadowing clinic with a vascular surgeon. So this provides them the opportunity of, one, developing the relationship with the GPs and the vascular surgeons, and be giving them that confidence that their decisions to apply bandaging, for example, early, were safe, and that later on increased the amount of compressive bandaging applied early and reduced amputation as a more distal outcome. So the nurse's confidence in applying early bandaging looks like as an intermediate kind of mechanism that led to other mechanisms later on, but it also looks like as an immediate outcome for the resource that was provided.
Yeah. So things aren't actually contexts, mechanisms, or outcomes. Things are just things. Confidence is just confidence. So I don't know if you were there right at the beginning, but I was talking about trust can be an outcome, it can be a mechanism, it can be a context. The same for confidence. So at one point in this process, you have early on, they have the experience. As a result of something in that experience, their confidence is increased. Confidence in that CMO, confidence is the O. In the subsequent CMO, the confidence is the mechanism and the outcome is applying the pressure bandaging earlier. So in certain contexts, and I would hazard it would be where the context is similar enough that they recognise their learning as transferable, then they their confidence acts as a mechanism which generates the outcome. When you then move on to your distal outcome, you've got different mechanisms. It's no longer the nurse's confidence, it's physiological mechanisms within the patient are reducing the need for amputation. So for the distal outcome, you've moved to a new set of mechanisms. Does that make sense?
That was a great explanation, Jill. That was good. Are you happy with that, Rasha?
Yeah, I think that was very helpful.
Thank you.
I think I just still find that at those intermediate steps, it might be that the outcome has actually happened at the same level of mechanism. I'm not sure if it's fair to say that.
Well, it's fair to say whatever you believe to be the case. Would I say it? No. So if you talk me through what is it that actually causes the nurses to be more confident?
It's the opportunity provided by the vascular surgeon being there and saying, yes, it is safe to apply the compressive bandaging. So they feel that their decision was right.
Affirmation. That's okay. Right. So the vascular surgeon is affirming them. That's happening at a certain level of the system. Now, is your argument that the affirmation happens at the same level of the system as the confidence?
This is what I'm feeling, is that the nurse had the information, so her confidence has improved immediately.
So information triggers the sense of being affirmed, what I would call affirmation. So the information coming from a credible source. Vascular surgeon equals credible source, context. Credible source offers information that affirms the previous decision. That's a cognitive process. I therefore feel more confident as a result. Is the affirmation on the same level as the confidence? I'm a pedant and I would argue no, because I believe the affirmation lies in the relationship between the vascular surgeon and the nurse, whereas the confidence lies within the nurse.
Yes.
But it actually doesn't matter that much, you know, like in the scheme of things, I'm splitting hairs here and it doesn't really matter. You could say that both the affirmation and the confirmation are mechanisms and the outcome isn't until it's a behavior. So quite a lot of people say it has to be actually something changed in the visible world before we would call it an outcome.
No, that's very helpful. And I think it's helpful in a kind of differentiation, the mechanism from the outcome, engaging in that way of thinking. So thank you very much.
So believe it or not,
entirely my pleasure.
We've hit 11:30, so this time has gone by so quickly. We do have a few questions left in the chat, so if people want to stay on and have debates about those, some of them can potentially be answered by others. There's another one around trust.
Really, really quick stuff. Anybody who needs to go, by all means go. But some of these I can knock off really fast.
If you want to just whiz through them, Jill, we still record. So if people need to go, they can come and access the recording later. I think that's one of the valuable things about adding, you know, keeping the recording in for this and not just your presentation, because often this is where the biggest learning occurs. So if you just want to rattle through, because you can see them,
I can,
and then we can do that. So we've got Adam Matthews is the next one. No, Alejandro wanted to ask a question, but it's not stated. So Adam Matthews is the next one that's stated.
No, hang on. The next one is actually on my screen is from Tracy. Is the mechanism what causes? Yes. Yes, mechanisms are that which causes. Full stop. Adam, is the candidate list of mechanisms finite or infinite? It depends at what level of abstraction and in how many systems you are talking. That's a very long question that I haven't realised, read all my way through. Adam, do you want to give me the short version at the end?
Well, the short version, I guess, is just how to start to approach and mechanisms or where to look for them, how to understand which ones might be candidates, especially in something like organizational change, the programs that are directed towards organizational change. It occurs to me that a lot of the middle range ambitions of realism, I think, is intended to create an understanding or a catalogue potentially as to the mechanisms at work. A bit like the analogy with gravity. Well, we know gravity exists, we know osmosis exists, and all of these things have been catalogued. To take that analogy into the social world, then my thinking was, is there a list that we can sort of work from, or at least work towards, perhaps another way of saying it?
Yeah. Sometime have a conversation with Dimitri about his attempt to do just that. It didn't work. Is there an intent to develop a catalogue? No, not as far as I know. Is there an intent to enable accumulation of knowledge? Absolutely, yes. And in order to do that, you have to have some, common things that you can talk about. So Ray's most recent book, Adam, well worth a read. And read the bit on generalization, which is section 3 of the new book, because there what he's talking about is what it takes for us to be able to transfer, so portability of knowledge, transferability of knowledge, and also to accumulate, which is like accumulate knowledge around particular mechanisms. So absolutely having middle level of abstraction. Let me start that sentence again. Having mechanisms written at a middle level of abstraction does enable us to accumulate knowledge over a wider range of programs, interventions, sectors, etc., etc. Ray did say at one stage that he would like to see a library of mechanisms. I don't believe it's possible. But I do believe that we would be better off looking for what do we think are the main intended mechanisms in this particular intervention, and then going off and having a look at what is already known about these main intended mechanisms and or the theories that support the idea that these things are mechanisms and the research in relation to those theories, so that we're not starting from scratch all the time, which
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that.
My pleasure.
We can move
See you
on
in England
to
shortly.
The next one, I think it might be the one by Andrew.
Yeah, it was already covered earlier, so no, that's great.
Okay.
Thanks, Joe.
Then I think we've got Rachel Josephs is the next one. Concepts as trust. I have to say I'm reevaluating how we've used trust and will use trust in future research, because it does feel pedantry sometimes. So we have got trust as a mechanism in our previous research, but there's just recent discussions I've had thinking, there's more to trust than we need to unpack it. So Rachel's asked
Rachel, are you there?
Yes, yeah. Just to give a little bit more context about this, how this kind of came about for me. I'm a PhD student and I was in some sort of like practice viva and progress review with somebody that was very knew nothing about realist methods. And in part of the chapter, I gave a very brief introduction to mechanisms, which I was going to expand on in later chapters. And you kind of touched on it earlier, Jill, where you mentioned this thing about the unobservable. In this kind of brief description, I mentioned mechanisms being like invisible and unobservable, things like that. And I used, probably like wrong, I see that now, but trust as an example. And they were like, but trust can be measured with validated questionnaires. So what do you mean that like trust as a mechanism is unmeasurable and unobservable? Because it is. And I was a bit like, the only answer I could think of on the spot was, I feel like using validated questionnaires reduces a mechanism in its parts, but I couldn't really expand on it beyond that. So I just wanted to see what your answer was on that and how to develop my thinking around it.
Okay, well, the short answer is read Ray's first book, which is called A Measure for Measures, because you're a PhD student and you should go back and read the original sources. The second part of the answer is that when we use a validated measure or whatever to measure something like trust, we're treating trust as a variable. Now, variables and mechanisms are not the same thing, and that's why you need to go back and read. That's what's explained properly in A Measure for Measures. The second thing, or the next bit of the answer would be, if we use a shorthand name like trust for a mechanism, what we haven't done is describe how it causes what it causes. And that's part of the necessary, that's necessary to make it be a mechanism, if you follow me. You know, it could be an outcome, it could be a context, it could be irrelevant, unless you're actually describing how it causes what it causes, it's not yet a mechanism. So that's the third, you know, when I said in my slides earlier, I've just realized I'm still sharing. Is it useful to pop back a couple of slides maybe?
Yeah, you can do. Yeah.
Let me see if I can do. Apparently my computer is not too keen on this.
That's because it's 8:30
So
that's why.
Yeah. No, it's because I haven't fed it a glass of wine yet. Gee whiz. So
you should have had one.
the
You should have had the bottle beside you.
Oh, I so shouldn't. A, coherence not helped. B, tendency to run on and give extraordinarily long answers, really not helped. So, Rachel, second bottom point from the end of the current slide, the processes or interactions through which those components and relationships generate their outcomes. You have to actually describe the process for it to count as a mechanism. So you don't just say trust is a mechanism, because you have to say what it's causing and you have to say how it's causing it. However, would I then argue that you can use quantitative measures to assess whether or not mechanisms are firing? Absolutely, yes. My reference here, Westhorp and Feeney, what do we call it? Using surveys in realist evaluation or something similar to that. Recent article in the Australian Journal of Evaluation. Our argument there was that we need to collect multiple data points along a process, not just a single point. So just assessing trust by itself is saying that trust is high, low, or whatever. It's not telling us whether it's changed, and it's not telling us whether it's doing anything that is contributing to the outcome. So you'll need more than just a measure of trust. Could you use your measure of trust? Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you.
I would say yes.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, thanks. That's brilliant.
It's like gold for PhD students, that, Jill. I'm guessing, Rachel, that you're a psychology student. That feels like measuring trust as a psychological measure. And as a psychologist, I find that I'm not really in that camp very often anymore. I feel like as I'm often told, I've moved to the dark side is their usual interpretation when they speak to me now. But you can get through it. You just need to find psychologists who work a little bit differently now. But we do exist. We do exist. So I think that's it for the questions that have been asked, Joe. I always stay on the end of these conversations, and we might end we try and stop the recording.
I just want to know whether
personal.
Is Alejandro still there? I think he wanted to ask a question if there was
Oh,
time
yes,
at the end.
Yes.
Hi, Joe. Thanks. I mean, I know it's 11:42, 8:42 now. Are you happy for me to ask? I'm happy to leave it for another time. No problem.
Yeah, go
no
for
worries.
it.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much. Really good to see
So
you both,
this
and
is the
good to see
person
everyone
who's
as well.
running the Realist Lens podcast, everybody, who's still left on the course. So as we said earlier, there's a big plug for Alessandro's podcast. So there's some links in the chat so you can go and follow it.
Oh, thanks, Joe. Thank you for that. That's great. And yes, absolutely. Please do, if you find it as a useful resource. No, the main thing I was thinking, Jill, and it's something that I've been thinking in my head for a while, because I'm also interested in the philosophical area and the ontological questions, and I find that fascinating. And one of the points specifically comes to when we see an outcome, and I think the answer is, it'll be derived around the data that you get, of course, but is it because there's been a lack of a mechanism firing, or is there a counter mechanism impacting on that? Because I guess that difference between the two is also going to impact some of the implications and suggestions you can make at the end. So I always thought when you see an outcome happening in mental health, for instance, which of course is my field, but in the social sciences, is that because a mechanism is latent and hasn't been fired, so like an unhelpful mechanism, for instance, or is there another mechanism that it's counteracting? So for example, love and hate, right? So is love kind of overarching on the hate, or when hate happens, is it like overpowering on the other, or is love not being triggered or not triggered? So that's my question, more of like the triggering of lack of, if any, or latent. I don't think there's lack, they're latent, or is it something that's being counteracted to see that outcome? I'm not sure if that question makes sense.
Makes absolute sense to me. So the answer is, the two answers are, so the slightly facetious first answer is, well, you're going to have to research it, aren't you, to find out, because we can't see the mechanisms, we can only investigate them. So, but the second part of the answer, and I think this is the more useful part, and again, it comes from Ray, not from me initially, is about developing alternate constructs for how it might work. So alternate hypotheses or alternate propositions, and working out how you would test those in order to adjudicate between them. So you're adjudicating between hypotheses, not just testing a single hypothesis. So you could have hypothesis 1, X mechanism is not fired. Hypothesis 2, X mechanism does fire but is outweighed by ... And then you have to work out how you are going to test them. I did it once with a much simpler example. Program called Maths for Learning Inclusion. The idea is to teach teachers how to work more appropriately, or teach maths more appropriately to disadvantaged children in grades 3 to 5 at primary school. That's where the disadvantaged kids start falling behind. Hypothesis 1 from one group of the people writing the program, all of whom are expert teachers. Proposition 1 is because the teachers themselves aren't very good at the maths and they're not confident to teach it in interesting and engaging ways. Proposition 2, don't be bloody silly. They're teaching grades 3 to 5 of primary school. Of course they know the maths, but their pedagogy is not strong. They don't know how to do it. So we've got maths content, we've got pedagogy, and proposition 3, which we didn't test in the same way, was that the teachers were in effect blaming the students, if they just turn up for school, then they'd learn, or, it's because their parents don't feed them breakfast, or whatever. We had a whole range of different data sources for the evaluation, as usual, but one of them was a single question in a survey for the teachers, which was a multiple choice question, which said, we know that multiple choice questions never capture reality, because otherwise people hate answering multiple choice questions. But which of the following is closest to true for you? I'm confident in my mathematics knowledge, but not in how to teach it in interesting and engaging ways. I'm confident in my maths pedagogy, blah, blah. So we had the two questions. Confident in my knowledge, confident in my pedagogy, not confident in either, confident in both. And we did the survey beginning and end of the school year and demonstrated conclusively that we had not, the program had not affected maths knowledge, but it had affected 15% effect size pedagogy. So by setting up the alternate hypotheses and then testing them, it is actually able to begin to sorry, I got distracted by the questions, to work out which mechanisms are and aren't firing. Was the end of that long rave.
No, that's super useful. Thanks. And I guess that confirms some of the hunches that I had around basically through the data and the questions that you're asking and the data that you receive through your analysis, that will give you a bit of an inclination into which one it is. But I've always found it fascinating just as a concept into what's happening. So that's really useful. Thank you.
I have to say, Alejandro, I mean, we're also working in mental health, and I find sometimes I sometimes call them the negative CMOs, because when everything works the way that they want it and patients improve, you can find those mechanisms. But sometimes when you're actually at the end of your data and you can't go back and test it, trying to parcel up those bits where the mechanism hasn't fired, I find the most challenging. And that's usually, even with us, and it's normally where we end up, because Jeff's on our team, it's normally where we end up bringing Jeff in. We have a big discussion about it, because I think those ones are really hard. They're hard anyway, but they're really hard when they're missing, because you have to think about it very differently. And what you want is the ability to go back and ask more questions, but you can't because the study's ended. So it's that never-ending cycle of realist research. So I think there's more messages at the end. I think someone asked about the sources. I've put everything in that you've mentioned. So we've got an excerpt from all the sources. I've put that into the chat from every slide, and that will also be in a comment underneath the recording as well, so people will be able to just take your references straight from there as well. Jill,
just hold on 1 second. I'm answering a question for Rasha with another resource.
Okay, no problem. This has been absolute gold, especially for the PhD students in the chat. I would have loved this one when I was doing my possibly some of the reasons why I still keep on doing this.
You know what, Joe? I would have loved this when I was doing my PhD too and all.
I mean, because I did mine part-time.
So when I needed me?
Exactly. Where were you when you needed yourself? So I think that's why we end up doing this sort of stuff, because when I started mine in 2015, there was just so little stuff out there to explain the processes. And each time you saw a paper, you were like, oh my God, this is what I did. I didn't know I did it, but this is what I did. And then I started these talks be just primarily to help people understand it, because there's so much confusion that exists. And I think these forums, and especially this ability to ask the Q&As at the end, just help you cement the ideas. And the amount of times I've spoken to people who've said, yeah, that was really good, and it's not necessarily me that's doing it, I'm just delivering these talks together. But what does help is if people get in touch and tell me what things they're struggling with, because then I can go and find appropriate people. So I have to say, today's was rather selfish. I had a dream. Jill came to me in a dream.
I think this is so funny.
In a classroom, and I was like too nervous to email her and say, by the way, I've just had a dream about you.
I think that is possibly the funniest feedback I've ever had in my life, Joe. But I like it a lot.
I told you, if we shouldn't work together, we're getting no work done. We spent the whole time laughing, but it would, I had an awesome dream where Jill was coming to me and telling me that she was going to solve the problem of trying to explain mechanisms to people. So there you go. So look, sometimes dreams do infiltrate. So if we do have any dream experts in the room, they can tell me a little bit more about what's going on. So I always stay on at the end of these chats. I don't have as long today because it's much earlier in my day. Normally it's the end of the day and I can stay on. But if anyone's got any burning questions that they want to ask questions to that may or may not relate to the subject of this talk, then stay on and see if we can collectively try and help you get to the end of it. We did a good job last time. We did a really good job last time of helping someone get through the quagmire of the challenge that they were stuck with, because quite often I find sometimes people can spend months and months and months grappling with a problem that somebody else can answer in 20 seconds. So for now, we'll just wrap up, and if anyone wants to stay on, then they can do. And Alejandro, you must have missed the beginning because we asked you to come on. I'd seen you pop up, but I don't know, because I saw you pop in a few times. I don't know if you had tech issues, so I don't know if you dropped out. So I tried to plug the Realist lens, but it wouldn't have been as good as you. But when we do the next one in June, if you can attend, you can also have an opportunity to plug it yourself then.
No worries, Joe. Thanks so much. I was having some trouble at the start.
Yeah, I
so
could
I
see
joined
you were
around
coming in and out.
half,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right, halfway. But no, it's been absolutely great. Thank you so much. And yeah, it's I guess it's like as we mentioned in our chats with Joe beforehand, which is hopefully increasing that accessibility of realist approaches, just to make sure that at any stage of the process, it doesn't have to be, you know, scary and complex, and it can be a very exciting process to go through. And hopefully through these conversations and some of the podcasts, I mean, the one tomorrow that it's been published is around ontology and epistemology with Ferdi Mukumbang.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
So
Ferdi's fantastic. He's lovely.
yeah,
that'd
he's
be really
fantastic.
good.
Yeah. So again, with all those words that can sometimes feel a little bit scary, then hopefully we can just make them slightly less scary, which is exactly what you're doing in here as well, which is fantastic. So thanks for the work that you do. And if anyone wants to listen into the podcast as another resource, you're more than welcome to as well. I know there's some people here as well that are either listening or indeed contributing. So thank you very much.
Someone's just said, Tracy's just said, she'll know if she's made it if I ever dream of her.
That's right.
Do you know my I've made it moment? I reached the pinnacle of my career when I was a PhD student, and Ray Pawson replied to one of my questions. That was it. I was done. So if anyone has any questions they want to ask, anyone got anything they're struggling with their PhD, please. Rachel, you got your hand up, so ask away.
Yeah, I guess it's more of a general realist PhD kind of query, but one of my main concerns at the moment is time restraints and kind of ill health, and the fact that that feeds directly into a very tight time frame. And I suppose that what I'm worried about is that being new to realist methodology is like how to do it well when I'm learning, applying, and worried about time restraints. I suppose, like, is there any kind of advice around that? Because I guess, yeah, sorry.
You probably don't know an awful lot about me, but I identify as a disabled researcher. So what you've just said, I could have said at the very beginning of my PhD. But I did mine part-time. So one of the reasons I had to is because my health did take a toll. So I had to convert to part-time. So that was one of the ways in which I constrained that. But the other thing I think, which is we all forget when we're doing PhDs, and I'm sure Jill's got significantly more experience in talking about the PhD process from the people that she's supervised through, is that it's a learning journey, and we have to demonstrate that we're learning as we're going through. Quite often I also find from people I talk to is that their projects are huge, like far too big. People think they're doing like £1 million worth of study. And if you don't have supervisors that understand realist methods, they can bolt on extra bits because they're worried that you won't have enough. And I think that is always a challenge. From a health perspective, I think this is like sort of falling outside of the realist stuff, but there's ways in working which will work best for you. So for me, my brain works much better in the morning than it does in an afternoon, which is one of the reasons why I always have the realist hub sessions normally in the afternoon. But that would be really cruel because it would be right in the middle of the night for Jill. So we've made special exception for everyone from Australia. But it's working out when you work well. You are in your own race. You are competing against yourself. So try not to compare yourself, which is really difficult, to your colleagues. You are trying to improve your own learning journey. Now, there are things that you can do to pragmatically reduce the scope of both reviews and evaluations so that they give you enough data to be able to satisfy the requirements of a university. The other thing I would say is write up early. Don't do what I did. Don't leave your methodology section until the last chapter you write because you're scared of it. Write it up early because actually it will help you with your coding and analysis and synthesis, because you will understand the processes that you're applying if you've written them up and had them, get someone else to review them, and get someone who's a non-realist to review it and make sure they can understand it. I don't know if anyone else wants to chip in, because I could just waffle forever. As someone who lives in that like chronic health management space, it can be very difficult and it can feel very lonely if you don't have other people around you who are also struggling with health.
Thank you so much, Jo. That's really, really helpful. And I think I really like the framing of like, this is my own learning journey, because I think, yeah, as soon as you start comparing outwardly, which is so easy to do, like to slip into, but yeah, thank you.
When I converted to part-time quite early on, and I'm watching everyone else that started on the same day as me, all graduating, you know, years in advance, getting jobs and publishing loads of papers and doing really interesting stuff, and I'm just like, still doing the PhD. But when you submit and you've had your viva, that great big weight that you carry around your neck that drags you down, the guilt, the PhD guilt goes. And my experience of postdoc guilt is it's not the same. It's easier to put it in its box and leave it. I think that might change if you do get the £1 million grant, that might change.
Thank you.
So I think the next one, I'm guessing is it Tracy? Yeah, it is Tracy. I just guessed off the initials TM.
Sorry, it was just in response to the conversation here, and I suppose what I tell the PhD research that I'm working with at the minute, and she gets very, very stressed, and I can remember that stress from doing my own PhD, and that was back in the day when there were none of these lovely guidelines and reporting standards and things. But I tell her, don't let perfectionism ruin your experience of doing this. The realist approach, I suppose the beauty of it and the difficulty of it is that it's creative. And it is this process you go through, you know, talking to others about what could be a context, what could be a mechanism. But when you try to get it perfect and get it right, you destroy the creative process and you destroy your enjoyment of doing this. So just always try and keep that in mind. There's no such thing as perfect, and there's no such thing as completely right. We are all truth seekers. To quote, I think it was Pawson or something like that, had said that. But hopefully that helps a little bit in the journey.
It does. Thank you so much. Yeah, because I often find myself getting really like excited by the data, like really immersed in it, really creative thoughts and making a million notes. And then all of a sudden I'm like, wait. And I'm like trying to be like, wait, what's the mechanism, and you know, and trying to feed it back into it, and I feel like I almost lose something a little bit when I like kind of snap back into reality, because it feels like it stifles the creative process by trying to really think about, oh my god, have I applied XYZ right, am I thinking about it right? So yeah, that's really helpful, thank you.
Can I just add a quick comment here?
Oh, sorry.
No, you go, Tracy. I can comment after.
Oh, sorry. It was just to say that as long as you have a plausible causal explanation, that you're making sure everything links, that the outcome can clearly be tracked back to what was causing the outcome, the mechanism, and what was necessary to activate that mechanism. So it's having that plausible explanation. Sorry, that's my last comment. Hopefully that's helpful.
It is, yeah.
My comment was going to be a little story from doing my own PhD. I did my PhD with Nick Tilley, but did it by remote control. So I was in Australia, he was in the UK. I went over for a visit, and Nick said, oh, while you're here, you should meet Ray Pawson. So I thought, yeah. And I went along to Leeds Uni and had a sandwich in the uni cafeteria with Ray Pawson. He said, tell me about your PhD. And I went, bleh. And he nodded wisely and said, well, that's 10 PhDs. Which one are you going to do? I think that is a little gem. A bit later, because I am totally, you know, constitutionally unable to stay focused, Nick said to me, Jill, a PhD is a small gem finely polished. It is not a mine. So I think the messages here from, you know, the great gods, Tilley and Pawson, is keep it refined. By all means, spend the time when you're in the creative mode, let the creative mode go, keep it going until you run out of steam on that bit, and then go back to it afterwards for the bits out of that which are right for the study that you're doing now, the particular piece of research that you're doing now. Keep the other stuff for later, because it'll probably come back some other point in time where you can use it somewhere else.
I totally agree, Jill. I mean, one of the things I did with mine was I had my research question on the screen when I was coding. I had loads of, I'm a bit like a magpie going off in all sorts of different directions in interviews, but actually, although it was great and we could maybe explore it in a future paper, it wasn't directly relevant to my research question. And so I just used to code it as miscellaneous or interesting or something in NVivo, so I could reassure myself that I hadn't forgotten, you know, it wasn't deleted, if you like, but actually trying to keep everything focused. I got all the way to the end and had to take out a whole chapter because it took it over the word limit. So that's a lot of time spent talking to people, transcribing, coding, analysing, writing up said chapter, and then go, oh my goodness, I've got to chop a whole chapter because I was well and truly beyond the scope of the word limit, the permissible word limit for the PhD. So the bit about keeping it focused and tight is something we have to do as well as you get through, but it's a learning journey. It's one of the things that, you know, so when people come to me through the consultancy, it's one of the things that we do through training is to help people see what is within scope, what would be super interesting, but actually you can't do because you can't tackle everything. And it gets more challenging if you have supervisors who don't have an understanding of realist methods because they worry about you missing important data. So then as a PhD student, that becomes harder. So we'll work on your confidence to be able to go back to supervision, to be able to say, actually, this is in line with realist methods, and we are encouraged to try and put tight boundaries around things. Otherwise, you would never stop. We'd just keep going. You'd start a study and do it for the rest of your life.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Luckily, two of my supervisors have great knowledge of realist methodology, so they have been quite good in bringing me in with some of my thought processes and things. So yeah,
I think you always worry as well that you're trying to say what you found is the obvious. You know, well, I've just found 2 + 2 = 4. Sometimes that you might have found something that's obvious, but actually it's not been written down anywhere. And we're finding that with our current mental health research. I'm finding stuff that people know, but it's not actually written down anywhere at all. So that's an important finding because then you've got something in black and white, something that policymakers can use to make change as well.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Yeah.
Right. If you're finding 2 + 2 = 4 in a realist piece of research, you're not working out why 2 + 2 = 4.
Well, hopefully
so
we are.
Realist.
Hopefully, fingers crossed. Hopefully there's a bit of the why there as well. But I think it's the just sometimes it's the I think I've been told that sometimes the way in which we can articulate things can just present them in a different way. So people know it's the outcome. They know the outcome, but they don't necessarily know what's driving the outcome, if that makes sense. So has anyone else got any more PhD type questions that they would like answered? Faye, hello, how are you?
Hi. I'm fine. I just both cannot tell you how much I've enjoyed this session.
Yeah,
It's
me too.
been absolutely incredible. And something you spoke about earlier about systems theory, Jill. What I'm finding with my PhD is that lots of the intimation that there's a theory gap in my research, my proposal, and that needs to be filled with you know, a handy off-the-shelf theory to mix in with the realist methodology. And I wondered if anyone else has found that and if there's sort of any skilled ways of negotiating that without just saying, well, it's critical realism, it's grounded in critical realism. And I'm grappling with the theory. So I was really interested, Jill, in what you had to say about systems theory and the relations there and how that might be best employed to deflect those discussions.
Okay, so at the risk of sounding, you know, I'm blowing my own horn, I wrote 2 papers that were published in Evaluation, so the UK Journal Evaluation, in 2012 and 2013, which were about using complexity theory, which is one of the forms of systems theory, in realist evaluation, but which also shows in one of the 2, and I can't remember which one it's in now, which also shows how I layered theories for different levels of systems. So I use different theories for the individual level, the parent-child dyad level, the community level, and the societal level. It is almost always the case that there is a theory relevant to the content. The other thing I did, my PhD is available through Nottingham Trent University. It's online there. In my methodology chapter, I distinguished between the theoretical frameworks for my methodology and the theoretical frameworks for the content of the topic. And I think that's really important because they're not going to be the same, but they potentially are going to be useful. The other thing that I do in teaching, and Kristen can tell you whether or not this is useful, is I talk about 4 kinds of theory. So there's the philosophical, really deep theory that can never be tested. So ontology, epistemology, axiology, they're all parts of underpinning the methodology, but they also inform formal theory. And there's formal theory, which is theories, you know, content theories in the areas of work, and there's almost always something that is relevant there. Then there's evaluation theory, which for us is, or research theory, which for us is the realist methodology. And then there's the program theory, or the theory of the thing in itself. If we're evaluating something or if we're researching something, then, you know, it's got its own theory. So you can conceptualize the theory as falling into these different domains and then use that to help structure your discussion of theory in your methodology.
Thank you. That's a great answer, and it's made a lot of sense. Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Rasha, are you still there? Rather than type it out, I thought I'd put it into the chat before, but the title of my PhD, look, I wrote a book, was Development of Realist Evaluation Models and Methods for Use in Small-Scale Community-Based Settings. It makes me laugh now because back then I thought the only evaluation work I would ever get to do would be in small-scale community-based settings. So the last time I was paid by the World Bank to help the Indonesian government design a realist evaluation, I thought of this and thought, who ever thought that the idea of models and methods for settings that don't have good outcomes data would actually turn out to be applying at all levels of all systems in all domains. Fancy.